Spoon theory started as a personal story put out by a woman suffering from lupus, using spoons to explain units of energy she might have to expend to do basic tasks because of her illness. It's been widely adopted in mental health and disability circles as an easy way to visualize and explain the struggles that come with mental and physical limitations. As such, I'll be using the idea of spoons going forward to talk about what some folks might feel they're capable of on a good or a bad day, though I hope these tips will help even folks without these struggles on days where you might want to throw in the towel but still feel you need to practice. With that, let's talk tips for bad days. Kairate! Before we get to the tips, I want to give a huge shout out to Maybelle, who sent me 3 books from Jean-Pierre Vernant: Myth and Tragedy, Myth and Society, and Myth and Thought. I can't wait to dig into them for my upcoming work on exegesis and epics. Thank you so much. With that, it's no secret that a large portion of the pagan community is neurodivergent, and quite a few of us also carry physical disabilities of some kind as well, or at the very least physical limitations. I personally suffer from chronic back pain and am diagnosed neurodivergent with ADHD, and I spoke to a large section of my server who were on the autism spectrum and or had ADHD when I did my work on anti-theism and ableism a few months back. Chronic pain and other physical disabilities can make traditional worship a challenge, as can neurodivergence, because creating any kind of habit can become a challenge when struggling with symptoms of ADHD, anxiety, depression, or a host of other mental health diagnoses. It's something I see alluded to in pagan spaces, but not often discussed openly. So let's talk about it. Keep in mind, I did an entire video about pagan imposter syndrome and how what you can do for the gods is most likely enough for them, and between you and them in the first place. So this isn't a video intended to pressure anyone into practicing when they don't feel they have the capacity to. As per usual, the tips are going to focus on Hellenism, as that's my own tradition that I know the most about and practice daily, but I hope that many of them will apply to other traditions as well. Which brings me to my first tip. Know your limits and plan around them. This can be really challenging for those of us that are neurodivergent, but hear me out. A lot of us tend to plan around the so-called good days, and then get disappointed in ourselves when we can't live up to the same expectations on more challenging days. I know that I'm going to be able to get a lot more work done on a day where I woke up, got my workout done first thing in the morning, ate breakfast, took my meds on time, and got a full night's sleep the night before. Disrupt any of those things or add a stressor, and now I'm on my back foot. If I don't set my expectations to the level of those bad days, I'm liable to end up disappointed more often than not, instead of pleased with myself for exceeding set expectations on good days. Beyond that, knowing your limitations and being honest with yourself about them allows you to do a bit more planning and prep on good days that will really help see you through the bad ones. My buddy Beefeld, when discussing the topic for this video with me a while back, mentioned that he bakes all of his ritual cakes and offerings once a year and freezes them because of a tip he read a while back about cakes being baked on a certain holiday and having an extra special meaning to them. A version of this could apply to those of us who run on spoons. If your offerings are already prepped early in the week and ready for you, you don't have to worry about baking on top of doing a full ritual. You can do something very similar with carneeps, or Hellenic lustral water. Ancient temples used to prep large amounts of it and store it in basins where worshippers would pay a coin and wash their hands before entering the temple. We can do a version of that as modern worshippers by either boiling a large amount of water for the match method, letting it cool and bottling the now sanitized water for later use, or creating a large amount using the salt method with a higher percentage of salt to water to keep anything from growing in it. Check out my video on Hellenic cleansing for more details about carneeps. Another friend of mine talks about putting carneeps into a spray bottle and spritzing the area with prayers instead of the traditional dipping of fingers or branches into the water to scatter it. Anything that makes getting into the ritual mindset easier. Knowing that offerings and lustral water are already prepped can remove one more barrier to getting into the ritual mindset. Having more than one set of ritual garb if you have specific clothing that you use for it, and making sure that it's laid out the night before you intend to practice if it's safe to do so, is another really amazing way to remove one more barrier to practice on bad days. Obviously, this tip doesn't apply for folks who practice in their everyday clothes or who are in the broom closet, but for those of us who aren't, having it there as a reminder can take us one step closer to getting the ritual done. Having prayer book collections around and/or writing out prayers that you plan to say the night before can be particularly helpful as well. If you do use prayer books, make sure to mark the pages that you're going to use the night before the ritual or on a better day if you're planning on a bigger ceremony or for a holiday or festival. Having these things prepped can really help when you're struggling. If you have a favorite prayer of your own for when times are tough, writing it down can make it that much easier to actually start practice. Many people who practice magic keep logbooks of spells and the like, and I don't see why prayers and rituals for Reconstructionists should be any different. By the way, if any of you are looking for prayer book recommendations, in my server, if you're membered in the Reconstructionist Resources tab, there's a pinned message with Reconstructionist resources for the aspiring Hellenist. There's quite a few recommendations there, and I own all of the books that I recommended in that section. Many of us do like saying elaborate prayers with beautiful language for typical rituals, or reading out Homeric or Orphic hymns or portions of the epics as part of said rituals. Sometimes, though, you just don't have the energy for an elongated or protracted ritual with such a long reading portion. Pain gets in the way, distraction is everywhere, what have you. Freeform prayer, especially if you understand the three-part prayer structure, comes to the rescue here. Remember, call, praise, argument, request. As long as you remember that and do your best to freeform something like it, you should be fine if you just don't have the spoons to do something more elaborate. Not everyone in ancient times was a bard and had these things memorized or could read them out. What's important is the prayer itself, not how perfect your performance is or which prayer specifically you chose to do. Not every single ritual has to be a full production complete with background music and a solo performance. Practicality is the key to spoony praxis. In my broom closet video, I also talked about altoid and travel altars and mini shrines. These can be placed in strategic places around your home or in your purse or pocket to ensure that even if chronic pain prevents you from getting to the household altar, you can leave a small offering or pray at the travel altar. Often, my limitation is simply getting to the space for the ritual. Having other spaces ready can help with overcoming the inertia and fear of not getting back up the stairs due to pain. Knowing your limits also means knowing when worship just isn't happening in a traditional way, and being willing to forgive yourself for it. Worship is supposed to be a joyful experience, where you come to the gods in love and reverence and offering, or seek their help for a major problem in your life. If it becomes a slogging obligation that you do out of guilt, dragging your feet and whinging about how the stars are simply not in alignment, but here's the gift anyway, much like I said in the Pagan Imposter Syndrome video, it's now become a detriment to your life instead of a benefit. If you all want a video about ritual attitudes in Hellenism sometime in the future, let me know. It was a topic that the ancients talked about extensively. To put it as finely as possible, it's better to either find an alternative to a full ritual or simply forgive yourself for not being in the right headspace than to force yourself against your best wishes to worship because you feel you have to. If you do find you can and want to put yourself in front of the altar for a full ritual, it's always okay to shorten it to either your patron gods or those you feel the strongest connection to at that time. As Hellenists in particular, many of us feel a really strong pressure to follow the lunar worship calendar that I covered a while back as exactly as possible, even when we're not feeling it. But the gods are far older than us and will likely understand if it's Apollon's sacred day, but your struggles fall more into Hermes' camp and you just don't have the energy for a longer ritual. Goddess is built over a lifetime of reciprocity with the gods, and every time you have a good day and can make an offering just in the worship on a sacred day, that doesn't just dissipate if you've had a bad day and can't get yourself to give extra offerings on ritual days for a while. Which brings me to ritual alternates. In my video on prayer, I mentioned the apote or if ever prayers that call on the cycle of Goddess for help when offerings aren't possible. Although it's not good to lean on these prayers constantly, when you're having a particularly low spoon day or having a really rough time, there's nothing wrong with taking some of that carnips you prepped, washing your hands, and praying wherever you are. If ever I have offered to you, Athena, hear me now. I have said variations on this prayer many times when things were out of control in my personal life, and I just couldn't summon the spoons or cope with the pain to go down to the temple room. As Reconstructionists, we focus a ton on offerings, what kind we should give, and how often, in part because it's a large portion of what separates us from Christians. But if you're in need and can't get to the altar or into the right mindset for a full ritual, there's absolutely a formula and historical precedent for prayers in a time of need, even if that need is just to get through the pain or stress that's necessitated the if ever prayer in the first place. Just remember to give extra offerings later if you promise them as part of your if ever prayer. Okay, so you don't have a pressing need, and you don't have the spoons for a full ritual, but you still want to worship anyway. What can you do? This is where votive offerings and devotional offerings can become extremely useful. Getting yourself into the ritual mindset with a few cleansing prayers and maybe a spritz of Kernips over your work area if it's feasible, and indulging in a constructive hobby or other devotional activity for a god can sometimes be a more viable offering than traditional prayer on rough days. I can't count how many times I've devoted my knitting or weaving practice to Athena, or the process of script writing to Hermes, because I didn't have the strength or spoons to make it downstairs and back up for a ritual in my temple room. The items you produce during these activities, depending on what they are, could become potential votive offerings in the future if you set it up that way as well. I have a lace altar cloth I'm starting soon that will serve as both a votive and devotional offering as it's produced, and this entire channel is effectively a votive offering to the gods in the entirety as it is. If you're struggling mentally but not physically, taking a long walk in your neighborhood or in nature while focused on the gods can become a relatively easy devotional activity. So can cooking dinner, with a portion of the food being kept aside as an offering to whichever gods you didn't do a full ritual to. The ancients saw Hestia's domain as the hearth and the cook fire, and burned their offerings in said fire, so cooking on the stove would be the natural outgrowth of her domain. Similar hearth gods and goddesses exist in other traditions, so you get the idea and how it could be applied more broadly. For folks with physical limitations, remember the modified prayer positions for ritual and other prayers from my prayer video are always an option, as is sitting down or choosing an alternate activity that would be easier to manage with whatever is causing your struggles that day. Chronic pain will see me knitting or writing or drawing all over my house, sitting, lying down, everywhere. The gods care more about the attention you're giving them than how properly you're doing it or not. We don't need to carry the prejudices of ancient times into the modern day. Your struggles aren't a punishment from them. They're a part of your journey and your relationship with them. Which brings me to my final point. Never forget that even with the focus on praxis or practice in reconstructed and other pagan faiths, these traditions most of the time are about building relationships with the gods. It's not about drudgery for an unfeeling, unwanted sky fathers that stare down on us with judgment. These experiences should be joyful and within your limitations and what is safe for you, not painful, struggling, and out of guilt. It's one thing to choose to bear through a bit of struggle to make it through a devotional offering. It's quite another to throw your back out even further because you quote-unquote must give an offering that day. We have a number of tools at our disposal to make worship easier, more joyful, and more possible. There is nothing holding us back from letting our traditions bring us joy instead of stress. Thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, bake the subscribe button and freeze the like for future offerings. Drop down into the comments with your favorite bad day and spoony tips, or let me know which ones you found the most useful. Or just tell me that religion is supposed to reshape your entire existence and that weakness is shame in the eyes of the gods if you're an idiot and that's your speed. Good luck if that's how you see things, I guess. Special thanks also to my patrons. It's been a rough ride the last couple of months, and to those of you who stuck with me through all of it, I owe you my deepest gratitude and thanks. You all don't need to contribute month after month, but you do, and because of it, I can keep making content that might only be useful for a portion of us, but still needs to be made. Your contributions are also helping me get my thermostat fixed and get central air installed so my animals can stop getting sick, and have made it possible for me to get research materials for my more in-depth videos like the calendar video. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.